The speakers that we'll be inviting to talk to us during the seminar series will be speaking to the theme of human development, capabilities, and higher education in Global South contexts. We're very excited today to welcome Dr. Alex Apsan Frediani. And for those of you who don't know Alex, he is a principal researcher at the Human Settlements Group of the International Institute for Environment and Development in London and in the UK. He leads the housing justice thematic work of the HEHD and also specializes on issues around human development in cities of the Global South. His work explores participatory approaches to planning and design of interventions in informal settlements in cities in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. He has also been conducting research and development projects focusing on the role of knowledge production and translation in advancing a more socially just, environmentally just urban development. In his most recent research initiatives, Dr. Frediani is a co-investigator for the research projects Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality and Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate. He's an expert affiliate of Architecture Sans Frontières UK and is part of the boards of Habitat International Coalition and the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center. We're very excited and keen to hear about what Alex has to say today, and he'll be talking, reflecting on a paper that aims to explore how the principles of participatory action research articulate with questions of climate justice and reflecting on qualitative case studies in various countries in the university context. Before we allow Alex to start to talk to us, I'd like to ask everybody just to join me in observing a moment of silence. And this is in honor of our colleague, Dr. Erasmus Masitare, whose passing we heard about just yesterday. We're all still quite shocked at his untimely death. And in order to commemorate that, we just like to observe a moment of silence. I know that people will be coming into the rooms and we will be hearing that beeping sound as they come in, but just join me in keeping your mics on mute while we observe a moment of silence for Erasmus. Thank you. Alex, I'm now going to hand over to you. We have discussed how long you're going to be talking to us for, so Alex will be addressing us for about 45 minutes, and then after that, we'll have the opportunity to engage with him, ask him questions in the Q&A session. So I now hand over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Well, my condolences to friends and family members of your colleague. Sorry to hear about that. And yeah, thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. It's really a great pleasure to share some of the ongoing work that I've been doing in this field. And yeah, just a bit of background. Before I joined the IIED, I was working at University College London. I was lecturing, doing research there. And I was leading a master's program on social development practice, and I was coordinating the practice module of that master's, where I've been for the last 10 years conducting a series of action learning partnerships between universities, my students, researchers, and also civil society and other universities, some of them in the Global South, as much as also in London. And we developed a series of participatory action research initiatives, which then Tristan McCallum from the Institute of Education was aware of some of those processes, and at some point Sandra Boni came to visit my department, where she stayed for a little while, and she facilitated a meeting between the IOE and me and my colleagues engaging into those processes. And it was in the context of that engagement that that Tristan became aware of some of the methodologies that have been developing and advancing, a lot of them also in collaboration with Sandra, that many of you know have been working in this field for many years around higher education and around bringing notions of human development within higher education institutions. So in that umbrella, Tristan was developing a big research project called Transforming Universities in a Changing Climate. And he asked me to be part of that process to support the development of a methodology that can support universities from different countries to set up and implement participatory action research groups connected to issues of climate change. So that's a bit of the background and how I ended in this very exciting project. Let's say it's not my higher education in itself as a field is not an area that I'm directly, let's say it's not my area of expertise. It's where I work mostly on urban development. Recently launched a book on thinking about cities and city making from a capability perspective. But it's because of that type of engagement that I've been doing around participatory action research and the mechanism to try to change university dynamics through participatory action research that the collaboration emerged with Tristan. And yeah, I've learned and I'm nurtured a lot by the work that Melanie Walker, Sandra Boni, as many others have done in this field. And you'll see that I'm not going to be here doing much of a literature review or trying to outline a more theoretical debate about that context. What I would like to do today with you is to explain about that project and about the operation of that project and what emerged out of that engagement and then what's some of the challenges. The project is ongoing. We of course had we are now on the third year of the project, but it feels like we are still in the first year because of COVID and the pandemic. So the project is now picking up in its speed. So it's a good moment to share with you some of those lessons and some of the aspects of that project. So that's what I prepared to you, is to share with you work in progress, a bit more what is that project, what we're trying to do, and then and share with you some reflections about some of the challenges, some of the issues that emerged, so that we can discuss them and have a discussion about that, about the operations of the project, but as much as any other aspects I'd like to pick up on, and we can take the conversation forward from there. So I'll start sharing on my screen with a presentation that I prepared. Let's see if you can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
I will put in presentation mode and let me know if you see. Do you see on presentation mode?
Yes, it's now in presentation mode.
Great, fantastic. Okay. So yeah, so this project is funded by the Global Challenge Research Fund in the UK, and it involves partners, university partners from 4 different countries. Apart from the UK, that project is led, as I was mentioned, by Tristan, and based at the Institute of Education, and then here in London. But it also involves universities in Fiji, in Mozambique, in Kenya, and in Brazil. So a bit of context. So yeah, those are the countries, and in each of the partnering countries, in Brazil, Kenya, Mozambique, and Fiji, there are 3 universities that are involved in the project. And the idea of the project is, and it has been, to then work with those 3 universities in each of those countries to support them in having a literature review, understanding the context of the university, how the universities has been engaging with issues of climate change. What are some of the aspects that has been shaping the responses of universities, and then under that analysis, then start supporting the implementation of participatory action research groups that could then advance some aspects of how the university could be better responding to issues of climate change. And then in the process of implementing those participatory action research groups, the idea was that we are going to be documenting this process, and we're going to try then to generate a set of reflections and a set of theoretical outputs, as much as the concrete actions, the initiatives on the ground, but also a set of reflections around the role of participatory action research in helping universities to respond to issues of climate change. So that is kind of the premises of the project. There are different work packages. As I was mentioning to you, there's some work package one is more around understanding the systems of higher education in the different countries, more of a literature review and policy analysis, stakeholder analysis. Then there's a work package 3, which is around trying to build a theory of university impact, of different ways within which universities can be generating impact on issues of climate change. That was work package 3. Work package 2 is the one that I'm mostly involved, is the one that is focused in supporting the universities to set up those participatory action research groups and document them. And then work package 4 is around then finding ways to share the knowledge that across the universities, but also with the international actors in this field. I will be talking more about work package 2, which is the area that I've been mostly operating, and I think it's what's more interesting for the conversation. One very important publication for us was a working paper, by Tristan McCowan, that he was talking about those different pathways to impact that universities have often used to respond to climate change. And it talks about, and I find very interesting those notions around, through education, which might mean through curriculum development. So there are questions here around how the curriculum addresses issues of climate change. It might be to do with knowledge production, and again, research activities and other forms of knowledge. How does that different forms of knowledge production again address issues of climate change? What do they address? What do they leave behind? What are some of the blind spots around that? Is there a policy around it? Then there is issues of what he calls service delivery, which I guess here includes the type of engagement that different university departments or actors could play with the industry or private sector, but it also with relationship with civil society and also local authorities or national governments in terms of providing particular types of inputs in the engagements that relate to issues of climate change. Then there is the role around public debate and how universities might be convening forums and spaces to have a public debate around climate change, and also looking inwards in terms of the operation of the campus, in terms of how the campus functions and how could more sustainable ways of campus operation, that's often relates to issues of energy use or in terms of recycling, etc. In terms of how they relate to issues of climate change. So this is very much like, let's say, it's a useful entry point, a starting point for us. I'm going to come back to some of those different pathways, because I think it's within that it is within that framing that we start thinking, how can participatory action research relate to those different pathways in terms of how can participatory action research groups be set up, and start identifying what we call them sites of impact. How do they aim to change the dynamics within a university? Would they like to change certain aspects of curriculum development, knowledge production, or is a combination of some of those issues is in the intersection. So it has been very useful as a way of framing the conversation, also to ask also the participatory action research group start to think through what type of impact, where do they like to see the impact in terms of their activities. So then just a little bit of a stop here in terms of how do we define participatory action research, because once we start defining that, we then also start infiltrating what we mean also about the role of universities to address climate change. And I have to say that the start of the conversation started on a perspective of the role of universities very much focused on issues of mitigation and adaptation, a bit technical in terms of the discussion of climate change. And but then as soon as we brought in participatory action research, we couldn't not talk about social environmental justice, which in a way started to infiltrate some of those conversations and some of those initial assumptions or premises of the role of universities to relate to climate change. So I think I'm talking to converters in this room about about participatory action research. There has been lots of publication around it, but just to highlight where I'm coming from, I'm coming very much from. I'm getting some feedback. I don't know if maybe somebody has a mic on. So I'm coming from a perspective that defines participatory action research from a very much a Freirean, as many others here in this room has been doing, where participatory action research approaches the role of participation as a right to produce, to participate in processes of knowledge production, and is a right not because it improves, not only because it improves, let's say, the quality of the knowledge that is generated, that's more responsive, etc., but because the process of production in itself is a trigger, is a process of personal and social transformation. There are emancipatory elements about the process of knowledge production here. And that's a very important dimension that has been part of our conversations on the setting up of those groups, or not necessarily on the setting up, but some of those some groups actually is about continuing on existing groups and networks, and how they can continue reflecting about how that process of engagement can unlock particular process of personal and social transformation. And again, yeah, one that ruptures attitudes of silence, accommodation, passivity, and deal with unjust conditions and structures. And for me also, something that we've been often talking to our colleagues is that aspect that participatory action research is unembarrassed to explicitly engage with the political. It's unafraid to consummate a relationship with emancipatory consciousness. So inevitably, we are talking here also about how the impacts of climate change is being experienced unevenly, that we have particular marginalized groups that have been mostly affected with the least capacity to deal with some of the climate change processes that haven't been their responsibility in generating at first place. So there is a broader implication, political implication here about the discussion. It's not a technical conversation about transiting from purely a kind of high carbon to a low carbon kind of economy, but it's actually talking about who is going to absorb the costs and the benefits of these transitions. So inevitably, when we start putting together climate change and participatory action research, inevitably that takes us to climate justice, and that was an important transition in the project to move away from a more technical, more let's say abstract, more technical approach to climate change, that then actually puts at the center this question around politics and also about knowledge, whose knowledge counts in discussions around climate impact of climate transitions, etc. I'm going to pick up some of those aspects of epistemic justice that are crucial when thinking about this relationship between the climate change, what is the impact of climate change, and also what is adaptation practice, what is mitigation, what type of knowledge generates that understanding for advancing those responses to climate change and participatory action research. So it brings all of that together. No? I think when we start mixing those different things up. Well, I'm not going to go into detail. I think you understood where I'm coming from in terms of participatory action research. It's one that it's knowledge that addresses real problems, unmasks political aspects of knowledge production, seeks action to alter conditions, build theories through practice and core learning. And very importantly, this fifth one for us has been very important. It's one that involves cycles of analysis, reflection, and action among participants. So it's this cycle, it's very, very important. We also quickly realized that all of those definitions or aspects of participatory action research is drawing very much from notions of social justice and is not necessarily, let's say, embracing or engaging with a discussion around environmental justice. So, for example, in this aspect of analysis of reflection and action, we often frame that in terms of very human-centered. And I think there is a lot of room here and a lot of space for us to start climatizing participatory action research, to start understanding how ecological systems, also how do we engage with in our cycles of action and reflection, how we are not just engaging with social relations, power relations, but we also here explicitly talking about those ecological systems, of how our actions relate to those ecological systems, how we reflect about human nature interactions, and then how actions can be triggered to relate to those. So I would say that participatory action research is very human-centered, the literature and experiences so far, and to expand that into a more like an analysis of the life-sustaining systems within which we live at the moment requires work that I think is still there to be made, and something that it's important to advance. I think I feel that's a gap on existing participatory action research practices and thinking of how do we climatize those different dimensions of participatory action research that has emerged very much from a social justice perspective. We have done a lot to think about decoloniality. I think, Melanie work has been done a lot of that, bringing the notion of the colonial theories into this discussion, epistemic justice. We have done, think about the racialization, the feminist aspects of participatory action research. And I think more could be done here to bring climate and climatize participatory action research. That could be an interesting point of conversation in our discussion. So now let's go back to the operations of the project, and I wanted to tell you how we did it. So the first step was to develop a protocol for the setting up of the participatory action research groups. This development of the protocol involved a lot of conversations with our partners when they were sharing of us ongoing spaces and engagements that was already in place, and where they would like to situate their participatory action research initiative. And as you can imagine, we have a variety of different contexts and situations. And the partners were, of course, trying to highlight that. And so we were also trying to hear from them what they understood as participatory action research, how do they have done that in the past, if they have done similar initiatives, so that we could try to generate some sort of reflection that could relate to their practice, but at the same time facilitate kind of knowledge sharing about how different ways have been done in the past to do this. And it meant for us that we need to be a bit elastic of what we meant by participatory action research. We try not to have a kind of ideal this is or this is not. Well, we try to be a bit more elastic to understand how have different universities engaged with civil society organizations, with other actors, public or private actors, how they have collaboratively set up common agendas. Again, I think somebody came in with the microphone on. If you could turn off your mic, that would be useful. Thank you. So then through those set of conversations, we then identify those different, let's say, we're not calling them stages, but they're not really stages because they are not one after the other. But there is definitely a moment of defining the group is getting together and defining the site of impact, what is the type of impact they would like to change. And that relates very much to the pathways I was mentioning earlier on. And in here, there was a lot of values associated of being strategic and being iterative, so that the site of impact is not one that you might start from there, but it's not one that maybe stays throughout your participatory action research engagement. That it's over a series of meetings that this might change, evolve, and again, so that's an important value that came from the conversations. We then identified a few tools that might help the groups to do this, and the theory of change was one of the tools that we have documented and shared with partners. Then there's another aspect is identifying group participants and roles. So while this first the site of impact could start with a small group of academics that want to advance this based on previous relationship, and then there is identification of a group who is going to be part of this process, and then then one would start reviewing the site of impact, see if this is relevant. And again, there is a lot of aspects here of doing a stakeholder analysis to think about influence and impact, the mapping of relationship. And that was something that the groups all did with the members of their groups. And again, here for us, it became very important to outline the values of being grounded on specific contexts, on specific situations, and also something that is historic. There is a history to it, that it's not just sitting in time that is bounded by the project, but it's something that is actually related to previous engagements and histories. And they're very important here also the aspect of emancipation, of how then this engagement tries to then recognize power symmetries, and also that has an explicit objective to try to deal with them. Then there is a set of aspects of convening the group, of how to convene the group, and how to engage different stakeholders. And here was very interesting, many contributions focused on the ethics of community engagement, on how to do that, and the importance of collective immersion in terms of not having conversations in universities or in particular spaces in rooms, but actually to go out there in the field. Something that became extremely difficult during the pandemic, and something that we had to start discussion, how are we going to generate this collective immersion process where we bring people from different from sectors to come together and experience something which we find is so important, that exploration aspect to change mindsets and to generate also shared values. I will talk a little bit from the contribution from Fiji here, but they really made a fantastic input in our protocol around the ethics of community engagement, drawing from indigenous practices and indigenous systems. And that was really beautiful and very inspiring, I think, for many other universities as well. Then there is issues around planning of activities. How do we plan together? How to develop an action plan together? One that it's co-produced, one that engages with diversity, that tries not to close possibilities, but maps different possibilities of action, and then how do we plan activities together and implement them? And then going to a stage of strategy and documentation, which is not necessarily, again, something that started very early on. So that's why I'm hesitant to call those stages, but those are aspects of it. But something that how do we set up from the beginning a mechanism through which the group is continuously reflecting about what it's doing, whose voices is being heard, what is being left behind, what are things that the group is making progress on, what are the things that they are not and that they need to come back to. So this learning and reflexivity became important values that in this conversation, and tools like participatory MEL frameworks was useful. All of this is is shared in a document that can be accessed online in the website of the project, and articulate maybe in a more beautiful way through this diagram than my previous slide. But yeah, if you want to have a look at that document, this protocol, which was very much co-produced with our partners and developed through a series of sessions and webinars we had, was a really important milestone for us. And we did the presentations to each other, and also try to share this with other stakeholders beyond the universities involved in the project. But it's something that they keep going back to, and they try to use as a resource in the process. So then the action part of it. So I would like to just share with you how am I doing with time? It's okay. We're half an hour, maybe another 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Let's
take your time.
Okay, great. And again, please, if you have any comments as I go along, please write something in the chat. It's easy for me to then try to respond as I move forward, or something we can come back to as well. So yeah, I'm happy to hear from you through the chat, or if you and afterwards share your questions. So then I would like just to highlight what's going on in some universities, so that you have a bit of a taste of what's happening. And so in Brazil, the University of Passo Fundo, which is it's a private university set up in the south of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul. And it's one of the universities. There are two other universities. One is USP, the University in São Paulo, and the University in Pará, in Belém, in the north. Both of the other ones are public universities. And they have different emphasis and different focuses. Very interesting. But I'd like just to highlight to you the emphasis of the University of Passo Fundo, that decided to focus their engagement on the setting up of a green office as a way to connect the different initiatives in the university and try to then to have a more sustained and strategic way of thinking how climate change initiatives would be integrated into university system. And so they've done a series of different things through the establishment of this green office, which in itself has emerged through the collaboration of different stakeholders, civil society, public, university actors, that together identified the need for such a green office in the university, and how they are managing now this process together. And that triggered, for example, in the top beta sessions with local schools to talk about rainwater harvesting, or with lectures from the discipline of architecture and urbanism to think about methodologies of scenario building, or also campus operation, for example, the cultivation of medicinal garden inside the campus as a way to then more collectively manage some of the spaces inside the campus. Really interesting types of mechanisms also to the management of resources collectively. And fairs, where you can see here some of the students then promoting some more sustainability and ecological fairs inside the university, which the Green Office is promoting. So really interesting here. We can talk more about this aspect of the Green Office as an institutional innovation, or where that can then cultivate, and not to approach those different initiatives in isolation, but then how they can combine into trying to also exert change into the more policy aspect of the university, and also with other stakeholders, and how they can then engage with stronger emphasis with government authorities and private sector to advance some climate justice issues. In the South Pacific, I have a video here that has been produced by the partners in the South Pacific University in Fiji. And yeah, maybe I showed you the video that's been produced by them, and then I can come back to it. Let me see if I'm going to be able to do this. I'm just going to share now my YouTube screen, and so that we can have a bit of a sense. It's something that has been produced by the colleagues in Fiji. It was a submission to the COP, and yeah, I will just share the video, and then we I can explain a little bit more. Let me know if you can hear it.
Bulavinaka and greetings from the Fiji Islands. Recently, the University of the South Pacific's Participatory Action Research Group held a series of Talanoa with the people of Watutavu in Papua regarding the experience of climate change. Climate change, according to the people of Watutavu, has brought about destruction to their vanua, and as a result, led to the local extinction of natural resources that they rely on as sources of food.
Okay, so somebody mentioned that you cannot see the video. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. We can see it in the 60 seconds, and it's clear as the.
So you couldn't see it. Let me try one more time just before I. Okay, let me try this one more time, and if we don't, it's okay. I can share the link afterwards. And just a second. So can you see the video now?
Yes, I can see it.
Knowledge, cultural practices, and maintenance of their vanua.
Sa sengan ni Laurenti na pero COVID quando baka jubiliwe pero ngasen sa sengan na bibaro otaki libu mati na bisau ya jubiliwe sa sota bitu do man to pandwa na sile bidani ko donc on wetu mapuno sa sine ko bitu man wetu men ngaliu usareza ni sa ko bitu men mango sa sing de biro raw na wala ni mata ko file ka baka puniti na tiga ko file so nangasi kama tanangane kondir nangasi sa sing kinta warati ko so de batakil kila ninto nandraki de baka ro ya ko mai sa batakil kila ndo ya ko mai dakala sa bola ka tito na uba bola ka tangilamba ayungan ng tawaro to na rito. Kahit ito di man nawales, bagay kilatin sa bola ka na uso na tagilam, kasi nimbo kita barot sa lagi kaya utungan ko, kita barot kung sa bola ka man tagilam sinong.
Nyayaw bula sa bisa usara nga bakalim. Imata kasi sautu nasa salu yung daging na ay lapar naika ng goling-goling sautu iway nga sautu iwoko na bunyi law-law. Yun ni buwa ka man. Sa lenga-lenga bakal usara nga. Yung mamidora bakal mo nga iway.
Antara nakakaw, saya na ikinig ng saya nasa salunin ito. Bedo magtangan na ulit yun, kinauliway. Saya na ito, hindi na makakarang doon kilig-din kinexultigil.
Ano ito po, ito kasi ito, ano ito po, betakosa sa sininikadib.
Despite the social, economic, and health implications of climate change, the people of Watutavu are weaving some indigenous practices with contemporary methods to help them restore and recover some of the resources and traditions they have lost.
Io tingana na wataraisunu wana titawa, singasana wataraisunu kitu wandola bakina. Kwa evika patana isu nangari lilimu para tumbuki ngai matasawa ini matani corona ya naika asel dahara biu mana lawa bango asel dahara naika
na kama sole bakia na vanua sa da kama chikuna len koro era sa tuwa tai meti tale sona casa ya litu me vale suita le mai na lo mani koro Nero ni kima mi kana chukina mbula chukina lini vanua. Ye kima ndo matangali tendo na nona.
To foster the recovery and maintenance of their vanua, the people of Watutavu are appealing to COP26 leaders to firmly commit to themselves in guaranteeing the sustenance of their vanua.
Kachingame me wadorele bunabulini I kavango mera nejela kina na le mali vakasama na kena tiwa le buna kau na kena marwe ne mami vanua ne kuani le buna kavava kena kai do yado tue
na tradisiongo na kanda sa tawango saya ngabe mga guru mi kede kina na kena buno takina me kono di sanga takede ni bulu o si na lut na vanua ngai le kina tamata bina na kena buli me la kutunga boleh me ringgara ramate kina na bakasam na tiula ko me ni rakila yo na lava sanga itiku medaka Olet edan da wele tu ya donale da bigia kitu nda sima kila na tamana bina kan la wale ko na buli ngia ko mona lenga osa samba itiki koroto sa kila tiku na kawadaka moro yo samba itiki na lenga
sa solinga na wili ni kau meti anda na matinitu matentungo bona lebu ni kau dotea ke baka resimi roa tani wili ni kau mertea solibiru ndo tiki ni lago mera somo mai somo bagi lago boleh tani resimi takabo na vika elabo ke ni vira
na me kwana wakamakana kana musukau tekau
Okay. Okay, so let me see if I can go back to my presentation. But yeah, I hope this gives you a bit of a sense of some of the one of the partners. And as you of course know, those are actors that are often not part of the conversations around climate change, around how they're experiencing climate change and the emergency that they're facing, but also what to do about it. And I think what the University of South Pacific is doing incredibly well is to then engage with this work and community engagement approach that hopes to recognize those knowledge systems, that recognize this uneven impact of climate change, and to bring that more explicitly into the conversations nationally. But also there was ambition here also to contribute to international conversations around climate change, and this video was produced in light of that, of trying to then be part of the submissions of Fiji towards the COP conversations. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting aspect of the work, where again I mentioned before about the focus on the indigenous ethics that the group is really trying to then think internally within the university, how to institutionalize those ethics systems around getting consent, around engagement, around reciprocity of outcomes, and the documentation of this process that the teams have been doing that for many years. It's hoping then to try to influence that aspect of university activities around issues of community engagement related to climate change, but not only, no, in terms of how they integrate it. That once you engage into this indigenous ethics perspective, inevitably you end up talking about from the lens that connects nature, territory, culture, history, and social relations. No, which is it's an inevitable intersection that happens once you bring that to the forefront, which is very interesting. In the case of Mozambique, what is very different in terms of their entry point has been mostly trying to focus on a public debate and dialogue about climate change, and to again raise the the visibility of the role that universities can play in enabling those conversations, public debates, as well as the role that it can play in trying to contribute to those aspects. So the Participatory Action Research Group has been focused in trying to generate a network of actors that can regularly meet and discuss how do you have those conversations in the public realm. So in television programs, you can see here is a screenshot from one of the news pieces that has been done about the project, but it's been taught throughout as a set of public engagements around climate change. So it's really very interesting. And that's what I mean, that we have to be a bit more elastic of what it's not the traditional, let's say, let's go and do a particular research collectively. And I think the way that the Mozambique team was framed was much more around, let's have a collective forms of dialogue around climate change. Let's generate new knowledge about climate change and also about what can be done and the role of universities in doing it. And they have set up a mechanism to do that. It was really, really interesting. I think I haven't talked about, maybe I jumped Kenya. So I think Kenya is a really interesting case, Kenyatta University, that they brought in this concept of counter extension. It's something that Boaventura Silva Santos talks about. It's not here, the focus is not necessarily on how to engage, to universities to engage with communities, with something that Kenyatta University has been doing for many years, but it's more like how do you facilitate the counter flows. So how the communities and the networks that the university has been working with can influence the operations of the universities, the curriculum of the universities. So it's been very much focused around this need of a counter extension strategy. Extension, I think, comes often from the Latin American, the Brazilian systems, where you have this idea of extension programs, where the university goes and engage with communities, and they have collaborative learning spaces. And then what's really interesting, this notion Boaventura brings around counter extension, that I think resonates really well with what the team in Kenya is trying to do. So those are the different practices, and then it comes the moment of, okay, how do we reflect about this, and how do we make sense of those different experiences, and how do we document them in a way that helps us to share learning. And I think through our conversations, then we started thinking of using the capability approach as a heuristic device here, as a device that might help us to exchange experiences and also to unlock different concepts and theorizations that is happening from those different practices. So I think that's how we approach it, and we made a few presentations, we had conversations, and then the teams felt that it was a useful way of trying to do this. And so we defined in the paper that is circulated in advance to this presentation. We defined, and it's been published in the Journal of Human Development with Charlie and other partners from universities, Jackie and Rosie, that are based in Kenya and in Fiji. We then define university capabilities as the choices, abilities, and opportunities that university have to advance climate justice. And we thought that what we're trying to do is the extent it's try to explore how participatory action research can advance the university capabilities to pursue climate justice. So in which ways does it do? And then if we want to then start mapping those relationship between participatory action research practices and the university capabilities, then we can start engaging with the notions of choices, abilities, and opportunities to advance climate justice. So again, university capabilities then shed light on the resources, the systems, the relationships, the values, and the organizational culture that shape the capabilities of universities to promote climate justice. I think it's a shift on the use of the capability framework from a more human-centered perspective. It's not the capability of people, but the capability of institutions, something that I've been doing in my work around urban development. So we thought it would be a useful operation here around higher education, and something that it has been there in the literature, and there's been an interesting one of the chapters from the book that Melanie and Sandra edited recently on those topics. That Sandra did a very interesting engagement in Colombia that starts also using a bit this university capabilities. What would be those university capabilities, but more generically, not necessarily related to climate justice issues. So then what we did was to break it down, the components of this university capabilities framework, and then asked our partners to reflect through them. And they are the aspirations. Those are the kind of the goals and the commitments towards advancement of climate justice. There's a series of questions here. Where are those goals and commitments? Are there policy around climate issues? Are there even more shared aspirations beyond the policy frameworks of the university system? Is there particular aspirations of students, researchers, of the people that work in the university? What are those aspirations there? But also, what's the wider kind of goals and ideals that university systems in a particular country has in relation to climate change, and how does issues of justice permeate those aspirations? Then there is a discussion around practices. What are the range of practices that is promoted by universities to advance climate justice, that here can relate to the practices associated to teaching, to research, to public engagement, civic engagement, to campus operations, etc. What are those existing practices? And then what are the capacities and the resources which relate to the abilities within the university to advance issues of climate justice? So here we're talking about human resources, financial resources, but also social resources in terms of the collective relationships. Are they there? Are they promoted? Are they placed? Are the teachers, for example, equipped to integrate in their curriculum particular notions, or where are they getting their formations from? And again, all these discussions around the different types of capacities. Are they recognized? Indigenous capacities to respond to climate justice, are those indigenous knowledge systems recognized as a set of capacities that universities could be drawing from and engaging with to respond to climate change? How is this done? And then opportunities in terms of what's the social, economic, political, and cultural conditions that are enabling or disabling university to advance issues of climate justice. So here again, in terms of the ways of doing things, is the ideology behind them. This clash that I mentioned initially between more technical and more kind of justice-oriented perspective on climate issues, as well as issues of incentives for teachers and lecturers to engage with those topics. How are those systems of incentives reflecting these concerns around climate justice, etc. And one can unpack in different ways. And we use a diagram that I developed in my book, but on Cities for Human Development, that I think was used as I mentioned, as a heuristic device to facilitate conversations. And there is on the one hand the university practices, and then what we're trying to understand is how those different university practices might be able to advance those university aspirations towards climate justice, and here in terms of education, etc. And then in between them, there are the conditioning factors, right? What we call the conversion factors in the capability literature. How do those abilities and the opportunities condition those different practices? If we have a new module on climate change, for example, through what are the conditions in place? Do they actually allow those aspirations to be achieved or not? And then we then have a set of questions that we started posing to our partners to try to reflect about their engagement. What are the university aspirations towards advancing climate justice, and how do participatory action research activities relate to those goals? Are they trying to expand those goals? Are they trying to question those goals, or are they trying to localize or to kind of make them more operational? Secondly, how do participatory action research activities expand the range of practices? I think it's very interesting that the intersections that participatory action research can generate between learning and research and campus operation. I mean, as a range of practices, how does it expand the range of practices to advance climate justice aspirations? Then thirdly, how do participatory action research activities improve the abilities of universities to advance climate justice aspirations? Abilities in terms of being more sensitive and inclusive in engaging with different knowledge partners and actors, and then how the participatory action research activities expand the opportunities. I think this is, again, a really crucial one in terms of how the participatory action research activities try to change the rules of the game in terms of the cultural practice, the policies, the incentives, etc. How are they engaging with that context that enable the possibility of those practices to achieve those climate justice aspirations. Of course, there is a broader set of issues around drivers, that is macro drivers, that some of the climate drivers, political climate drivers, based on education systems that goes beyond often the scope of influence of participatory action research groups and often of universities themselves. But I think something that we have often tried to have those conversations about what are those drivers, what are those conditioning factors that those activities are not in asylum, they operate in a particular space, and then to have a more collective discussion. What is the trajectory that we are promoting here to advance climate justice through participatory action research activities in terms of how universities play a role there. So my final thoughts, and this is my final slide. So we just to highlight that some of reflections around these dimensions are reflected in the paper, but we haven't yet we haven't yet documented this process enough to then start to generate like, let's say, findings across different places. So that's something that is yet to come. So watch out for that. If you're interested, we're going to continue trying to share some, but it has been difficult to set up a systematic process of documentation. It has been much easier to talk about how the universities can generate those groups to generate action, and that has worked quite well, and there is a lot of momentum and energy around them. But then on top of that, to develop a system through which we can document those processes, and so that we can generate some wider reflections, it hasn't been easy, and we have tried to deal with it by having a kind of a learning officer in each of the groups, so that they can take more that lead around the documentation process. But we have very different mixed experiences. Some people that involved come from a more quantitative background and engage with more qualitative analysis of power relations within the group dynamics. It hasn't been easy. It hasn't been easy also to even talk openly about some of those power dynamics that happens within groups, or also between the groups and the universities. As we all know, how it's difficult to have an open conversation about those power asymmetries, but that's something that we continue trying to find ways and strategies to bring that to the conversation. Second point I wanted to share with you is what is the right balance between the situated theory building and the request for a shared heuristic device. There was a lot of the groups often told us, please bring us some shared lens through which we can implement those groups, or through which we can reflect about them. And we've been very hesitant in the beginning because we didn't want to have such universal way of framing issues or thinking through them. So, but at the same time, it was something that was very much in demand to help the implementation. So then we came into this. Again, we try to frame this as heuristic devices, as a starting point, as maybe a set of questions. A planner from South Africa that actually passed away recently, called Vanessa Watson, when she talks about the kind of the colonization of planning research, she talks about the traveling of questions but not answers. And I think that comes in a similar spirit of trying to say, how do we collectively think about the right questions that we can travel to different places, that we can then unlock different conversations about them, which then can be shared and compared. Then what is the role of international partners? Then we often saw ourselves as facilitators of translocal horizontal learning, and often then across the main participants of the group, which are often university actors, but then what happens to their partners, their civil society groups? we didn't have scope within the project then to go a step further and say, well, actually, let's try to facilitate learning across the community groups of Fiji, Brazil, and Kenya that would be also often marginalized in terms of the opportunities to share their experiences internationally. So how to trigger that has been a key challenge for us. So who shares and who learns, but also, as I was talking before, the expectations. At some point, community partners, they often come, so tell us what you want to do. So that we can and to change this attitude from like it's not about, which is inevitable given the way that the project in itself emerges in this type of international partnerships. But then how do we frame, well, how do we build a more horizontal way, a more collaborative way of defining what we can do together, and then shape the activities in that way? It hasn't been straightforward. And then what do we mean by comparativeness? What is comparable in this kind of situations, and most importantly, who compares? And we, it's not unusual that in projects like this that the comparisons ends up being at the office of the university that is leading the project, and that receives all those different inputs and generates a kind of comparative analysis. But how can we actually disrupt that? How can we create within the project spaces conversations that comparativeness can happen throughout the process, from the beginning of the designing of the implementation, as we've been trying to do, but also within countries, across countries. It's an ambitious objective, and we'd love to do things like that. But at the same time, also, we're operating with difficult resources, challenges in all the different fronts. But something that we're continuously asking ourselves, how do we enable this comparativeness that is more horizontal and that happens across places? So I will stop here, and I talked quite a bit, sorry for this, but it would be really great to have now a conversation with you. And thank you so much for this space. I'm sure this is going to be it's been useful just to putting together this presentation, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I think you're going to have a moment now just to draw your breath while people also share their questions, their reflections in the chat. We already have one question there. If people feel more comfortable just to unmute themselves and ask their questions directly, they're also welcome to do that. So I'm going to give you a moment to read Bill's question in the meantime. And if there are other people who've got questions, comments, anything that you'd like to say in response, for us to have a discussion around the talk that Alex just gave us. And I was taking down a few notes as you were talking in the beginning about research being a transformative endeavor, and participatory action research being proudly and loudly political, working towards emancipatory consciousness, questions around epistemic justice, and how participatory action research seeks to change the rules of the game, particularly in relation to power asymmetries, both within groups and across them, and the questions about Indigenous ethics and how they're taken up, as well as the local knowledge or Indigenous knowledge systems that they come from. And then towards the end, for me, I was, really interested in what you said about the capability of institutions, especially coming from a research group that does work with the capabilities approach in higher education, but we tend to talk more about the capabilities of human beings and not institutions. So I'm sure that there are many questions that people have around this issue. If you'd like to respond to Bill's questions, you can go ahead. And then if there are more questions, I'm sure they'll come through in the chat. After that, if there are people who'd like to unmute themselves to ask their question directly, they're welcome to do so.
I agree with everything Bill is saying, so I think it's a great set of inputs. So I think that so I in terms of the focus, the first question around actionable knowledge, I think in all of the groups, I think there is that aspiration to generate actionable knowledge, sensitive to context and harnessing existing spaces. So, for example, I didn't talk about the experience in Brazil, for example, but in Belém, the university operates through. There is a space of there is an entity, like a kind of space of dialogue between the university, public authorities, and indigenous communities, where these collaborations between university, public sector, and indigenous groups have been happening for many years to resist deforestation in the Parás Amazons. What the participatory action research activities from Berlin is working through those structures, which is really exciting, because I think it is working, it's supporting those ongoing spaces where indigenous rights has been promoted and trying to influence the process of deforestation and commodification of lands in that area. So then the actionable knowledge and very politicized nature is very explicit in that engagement, and I think it's a really interesting one. I agree that universities very much are agents of colonization of knowledge. It's exactly, I think, and a lot of that can happen through climate discourses. We've seen that, and some of those discourses even permeate aspects of this project and partners in this project. But I think what has been very useful is to have an open discussion about some of those and trying to collectively identify within our own practice when we're seeing that this aspects of coloniality is being reproduced, and how can we be aware of those, and then how can we find ways of trying to challenge it. And as I was saying, being very honest, I don't think we've been able to address some of those challenges that we have become aware that we are reproducing in our practice. But I think collectively it's a step forward, as we are recognizing that as we do, we are inevitably reproducing a system that is colonial, that is patriarchal, and is also very racist. So how do we then acknowledge from the starting point that premise and try to work through it? I think it's a step forward in that direction. And yeah, we are focusing on universities here because it's very much centering the discussion. It's not to say that other spaces are not important, but to say that our object of study and impact is the university, because we argue that the university structures and system needs to change if we are to address some of those. It's not the only thing that needs to change, but it's something that is important to change in the fight for climate justice. I will stop here and maybe I can talk more. And thank you for the references around documentation. Yes, I know it's been for ages. If there are specific resources that you think it to be useful, please share. We would love to see them as well.
Thanks, Alex. I do see a hand raised by Daisy. Daisy, go ahead and ask your question. Just unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. So my questions are quite a number, but I'll try to summarize. The first one is, I would like to know what criteria was used to select the universities and the regions, looking at the fact that issues to do with the environmental issues and climate change are in different stages in African countries. So what criteria did you use to select the universities that you selected? And also, after the selection of those universities, were all the participants of environmental orientation, or there's some different backgrounds altogether? Then the other question is, what were some of the challenges when it came to community engagement, looking at the fact that climate change issues have a lot of technicalities, so understanding those are based on different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, and also they're also related based on different issues to do with vulnerability. So did you have any complexities when it came to community engagement in particular?
Thanks, Daisy. Alex, would you like to collect a few questions, or would you rather move on with? Okay, all right. So I see another hand raised by Ntimi. So Ntimi, you can go ahead and ask your question. And then there's also a question from Melanie. The first part is related to the question that Daisy asked around the selection of universities and participants and so on. But I'm going to let Ntimi ask his question now. Go ahead, Ntimi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. I had a Zoom meeting, a Google meeting with Tristan beginning of this year, talking about this project. I was very excited to hear about it. I have a question, a very simple one, but maybe complex. And my question is, we know university are knowledge institutions, that they are core technology, teaching, research, and of course they do engagement. That's another, a third pillar. To what extent do they link these two, the teaching and research, to whatever they do within that realm of climate change? Is it purely, we're just doing this more like, out of research? We want to do this. Are you guys trying to contribute to something in line with university, just contributing, not necessarily linking research, more like an NGO doing this kind of work, or like a knowledge production institution? I don't know whether my question is clear.
Thanks, Ntimi. So Alex, you can decide if you want to address those two questions and then perhaps look at the other two that are in the chat from Melanie and Tiffany thereafter.
Okay, so maybe I start with Ntimi. I mean, what are we trying to change? I think that's a very good question. And I think we do have the emphasis on changing the role, thinking more critically about the role of universities, highlighting, I think, the aspects that was mentioned in the chat by Bill around the fact that we feel that universities have been part of the problem, and that and having this kind of conversations around the role of universities has been not necessarily the site of impact that I've been doing more internationally, but definitely the work Tristan has been doing is to work with different institutions and knowledge systems internationally to try to advance more critical thinking around how universities can play a role productively in dealing with societal changes and dealing with challenges such as the commodification of university systems and grounding the role of university more in this kind of societal developmental aspects of it. And I think that has been part of Tristan's work, and that I think I did a bit of that inside the UCL, and I was operating. I think that's what's coming. How I end up in this conversation. But I think that's I think it's part of that. And then many of the partners also have been part of conversations at the UN system to try to create also university regulatory frameworks or promote different concepts, commitments and systems to promote a different way of university operation that can deal with issues of climate change. But I think here pushing that a bit further to go into issues of climate justice. And I think that's what I think the project is trying to do. And I think there are other actors in this space that you all will know much more than me, that I think is useful. In terms of identification of partners, this is something that was led by Tristan, and I think that it emerged a lot out of existing collaboration that Tristan had already in this space and the partners. So there was already an ongoing relationship with Universidade Passo Fundo and USP, and in this context, and the universities, and also in Pará, in Brazil, Tristan had. So it was not necessarily based. It was a network of universities that Tristan had already been working with, or colleagues at the Institute of Education, that collectively decided to develop a project that focused on issues of climate change, on how universities respond to climate change, and then start to build a team around it. And I think that's how it emerged. And then what is happening at the moment is that the research is slowly moving. The research project feels that it's slowly moving into more of a network. So there are new universities that are approaching now the Climate U and kind of saying, can we become an affiliate to Climate U? We have our project in Morocco with a university that applied for some funds from the British Council now to be part of Climate U. And so I think what we are seeing is transition from an initial project to a more network, which I think is exciting, and it's going to start opening up a space for universities that are interested to advance this agenda, utilize participatory action research methodology to advance climate justice, to change the university systems, to share knowledge around it. I think it's very interesting. In terms of challenge of community engagement, wow, yeah, I mean, that has been so, I mean, expressed by the different teams in various different ways, and it is really ongoing in terms of that. And it's really interesting how different institutions has created different ways of facilitating that interaction. And you know, in University of São Paulo, for example, they did an open tender. They made a call and said for students or researchers that would like to engage with communities on issues of climate change, develop a project collaboratively with communities, submit, and we're going to have this criteria where we're going to select the initiatives and we're going to support you with it. And then that's been an approach to then be more open to some of those processes. And then they try to support them. A lot of them using schools, existing organizations to facilitate and institutions to facilitate engagement with community actors. In the case of São Paulo, they're also working with a national youth group across universities that is lobbying for changes in university systems on various issues and around this climate change. So that's really exciting as well. So that's a community in itself, a community of young people that's trying to exert influence on national university policy making. And I think and they've been part of the process of selecting and creating criteria for. So that's some of this. And in other cases, it's like with the University of Pará, which is super rigid and kind of it is through the existing system, and it has been also very difficult to have conversations around the internal politics of those groups. What are some of the asymmetries of power that the legacy of previous engagements promotes? So all of that temporality, I think, has been a challenge for all the groups to deal with. Those that are trying to set up something new, but then how do you do it? To those that are trying to promote something that's ongoing. So anyway, there are several types of challenges. Maybe I need to organize my thoughts as we move forward and share with you in different moments, something more organized, but there are very different types of challenges. I haven't been able to read the chat for questions. I don't know if you can help me, Mika, with the questions.
Sure. There's a question from Melanie where she's asking for clarity about how the shift happens from a technical approach in the university groups and how this has happened through discussions during the participatory action research. Okay. Yeah. So, and then so also later on asked transformation.
Yeah. So on that one, the shift, I don't think we have achieved the shift yet. I think we are on the shift making, and I think our continuous effort to ask questions around differential impacts of climate change. How this has been really important. But okay, how is this related to an uneven impact of climate change? Are those groups that have been mostly impacted, that are most vulnerable to those changes, are they part of the process? How are they being engaged? How are they part of the deliberations? And asking those questions. And again, then how to move on to from a very essentialist, but we have women in our group. Okay, that's a good start. And then how do we move on from the politics of presence to the politics of recognition has been, again, another very, very challenging aspect in the groups. And how do we trigger that more deeper sense of, okay, but then how is the issue of patriarchy being dealt with in the group? Have you dealt with issues of gender dynamics? Have the group been discussing about this intersecting nature of how I guess, when we're talking about the impacts of climate change, it helps a lot, very material. Okay, you're talking about soil erosion, landslides, okay, but how does that actually impact different people in their particular experiences in places, and how we take into consideration those nuances about those particular experiences of climate change. And I think this continuous kind of questions around this line has been useful, I think, and I think that there is a more general awareness about the need to do it. I still feel that it has been difficult to then do this together. We were hoping that we would have moments of interactions between groups and with us that would allow to see each other's work in the field and to be inspired and have conversations that would help us to make that shift more concrete. But because of COVID, we haven't been able to do it. We're just starting again to plan, and I think that's been a massive impact to our project. Is not having those moments to collectively go to a particular place and reflect, okay, but how is this happening here, and then to unpack some of those things collectively, and then to make those issues more visible.
Great. So we have another question from Tiffany, and I think hers centers mostly around questions related to the curriculum. So in terms of the extent to which these things are being taught, and then also in relation to assessment, when this knowledge is being included in the curriculum, how do you then assess it, not based on typical exams that are just marking whether people have captured the content and sort of regurgitating it in exams, but more sort of meaningful understanding of these concepts. So that's Tiffany's question, I think, in a nutshell.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. I mean, I agree. I totally agree with you. That's a massive, it is a really important aspect. And many of the groups are precisely concerned about this. To be honest, it's how do we then translate it back into the curriculum development, and how do we represent that in the curriculum? And so there is an emphasis around the kind of like instruments for curriculum development. Do they allow those issues to be recognized? Like, for example, when you're looking at let's say in the case of the architecture students, when they need to meet basic architectural criteria for their courses to be accredited by the architectural system, are those criteria that the architectural associations, are they reflecting the need to engage with climate justice? And often the answer is no. So then at best they talk about we're talking about technological innovation, but rarely we're talking about this more politicized and more justice-oriented aspect of climate change. So then there is an emphasis here to also try to lobby those systems, those associations that are accrediting courses that often shape the content of those programs, because then the university lecturer comes and say, I know I need to do this, but for my course to be accredited, I need to meet those regulations. And so how do I can create an elective, but then we only preaching to the converters, we're not like mainstreaming this into the basic. So this is often the conversation around that. And then, but I agree with you that it goes all the way to assessment. Once this is integrated, and but yeah. So the spectrum of the conversation, I think it's very broad around how to, and the need is still, I think we're still in very infant stages of doing that more meaningfully and systematically across different disciplines.
Thanks, Alex. And then we have another question in the chat from Bill, again, who's talking about how starting with the Freudian approach is all good and everything, but how far are universities taking and using and implementing a Freudian approach or ethos in their participatory action research? So yeah, that's what his question is about.
Again, I agree. I think it's that ethos is starting from us as a group in terms of is the basis of our reflection. Right, so is to say like this is the standard to what we would like to reflect from, is in terms of trying to have a shared understanding of what we, in terms of our ambition or aspiration for participatory action activities on the ground. But yes, when it hits the ground, we can see that this manifests in very different ways. But we are trying not to create the kind of situation that we try to say, how far are you meeting this, ideal, but actually trying to say, how does this manifest in your context and what are the issues? The Fiji example is fascinating. On the one hand, it creates so many different nuances about epistemic justice that is often not captured in the Freudian approach. But on the other hand, it also replicates a series of very nearly contractual relationship between university that also raises challenges there, that once you approach that from a Freudian lens, how does that, but we also don't want to come to we would like to understand that, how is the history of that type of engagement, and why does it play out in the way it does, and then and it is a Freirean perspective useful to reflect about some internal dynamics, and then try to, again, to trigger conversation about it. So it's, again, within the project, we're trying to use more as a device to trigger those reflections and those conversations, rather than to use it as a standard that we like to kind of say, okay, are you meeting those standards? Are you doing? Why are you not? What's the bottlenecks that stops you from doing it? I think that could have placed the project in a more problematic hierarchical kind of situation. So I think that's how we are framing it, because yeah, I'll stop here.
All right. Thank you, Alex. I don't see any more questions in the chat, and then also no raised hands. We've only got about 5 minutes left. A question that I was thinking about is the lifespan of these type of projects. As somebody who's worked with participatory research projects before, and I know that you mentioned that they often come from reflections, experiences that have been had before and talked about and discussed within particular groups, and that now this project is growing from a project into a network. So I'm kind of thinking, how do you know when it ends? How do you know when the lifespan of these type of projects have kind of reached their end goal, and who decides that?
Can I take this to Tristan and talk to him about it? I think it's a great question. I think it's a really, I'm always thinking about time a lot in my engagements on different projects around participatory action research, right? How to break from there. We often end up framing time according to our project cycle, and because the nature of our work pushes us to understand time in this way, but having the preoccupation to understand the history and the timeline of the activities that goes beyond, that is inside our project, but is not our project. Understanding that timeline is so important, and understanding what's going on in that timeline, right? So where is that coming from? Where are those relationships being before, and what's the history? So we are encouraging the different groups to actually draw this timeline of collaboration that have existed before, and to map those more explicitly. The life history of partnerships, and that I think it's really important to understand that, and to understand the culture of those relationships before, so that we can then position our work, and then that we can, in that context, have a conversation about the question that you're posing. Okay, once we understand this history, then we understand where we are located in those histories of partnerships, and then we can have, okay, so what's next in terms of where we're going. And the problem here is that we have not a problem, the excitement, let's put it that way, is that you have those different timelines. There's the timeline of each university and their partners. There's a timeline of the collaboration across universities within the countries. And then there's a timeline of the engagement of the project as a whole. And so I think within each universities, I think the universities have been very clever to stretch time. The Green Office is a super clever strategy to say, this is okay, we are using this project to fund the setting up of this project, but actually the project is now, the Green Office is going to live once the project finishes, and it's going to live as an entity. And what Belém is doing is very interesting, and different institutions trying to think about that. And I think we are only starting now that conversation about what does it mean to shift from a project to a network. If Climate 2 becomes a network, then and I think what will be successful for us is that it's a place that universities sees as an added value to discussions of this nature. If they want to, it's a kind of one-stop shop. How do you say it? If universities want to learn more about how to utilize participatory action research activities to advance climate change and change the way they operate, there's this set of universities that are trying to do this, and that could be a good place for exchanging knowledge about that, to share experiences, to learn from others, to try to build partnerships internationally, and I think that would mean success. I think if we are able to create such a infrastructure for networking, for knowledge sharing, for horizontal learning, I think that would be a really useful infrastructure to have, and then through that advance those agendas of climate justice or participatory action research issues that I've been talking here, and try to promote those values and continue this conversation.
Thank you very much, Alex. We're out of time, and I have seen some thank yous coming into the chat. Thank you very much for helping us kick off our seminar series on a very engaging chat that I think has been informative and quite inspiring for a lot of people. So thank you very much. For the people who are still here, if you don't mind, just unmuting yourself and in joining me in giving Alex a round of applause for today. I think it was a great talk.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation again.
Thanks, Alex. It's excellent. So good. Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thanks, Alex.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mikiteko, Talita.